I want you to picture something with me for a second. Just close your eyes if you can. You are standing high up in the Sierra Nevada mountains. The air up there is thin, it's incredibly crisp, and it's almost dead quiet, save for the wind moving through the pines.
Right, just totally isolated.
Exactly. You're on this dirt and rock trail, miles away from any paved road, no cell service, just no trace of modern infrastructure at all. And you look down at the edge of the path beneath your boots. Holding up the earth, like literally keeping the entire trail from simply sliding down the steep slope of the mountain into oblivion, is a dry stone retaining wall.
And we should probably clarify what dry stone actually means in this environment, because it's a marvel. It means there is absolutely no mortar holding these rocks together.
Wow, none.
None. No cement, no modern adhesives, no steel rebar. I mean, it is just gravity, friction, and, an almost incomprehensible amount of human intention.
Just raw rock stacked on raw rock. But here is the kicker for you, the listener. This wall was built 90 years ago.
Yeah.
Think about what that actually means on a mountain. That is 90 brutal winters of freeze and thaw cycles, which, normally tear rock completely apart.
Oh, absolutely.
90 torrential spring snow melts actively trying to wash the foundation away, millions of boots hiking over it, decades of seismic activity, and yet it looks like the trail crew just packed up their tools and finished it yesterday.
It's incredible.
Right. And we know this specific wall and we know its condition because of the person who serves as our guide for this entire exploration today, a man named Nick McKenzie.
Right.
So 50 years ago, back in the 1970s, Nick worked on a U.S. Forest Service trail crew in these exact mountains. He swung the tools, he built these trails, and he knows exactly what he is looking at when he studies stone. And he's the one who compiled the massive stack of source material we are diving into today.
Yeah, and the sources Nick pulled together for us are just incredible. I mean, we are not just looking at some dry historical summary. We're looking at Nick's own 50-year-old field journals. We have original 1930s structural blueprints from the federal government.
Which are fascinating to look at, by the way.
Oh, totally. And we have these dense, heavily annotated legislative tracking sheets from the 1990s and the early 2020s, plus hundreds of pages of recent federal court filings from just, last year in 2025.
It's a gold mine.
It is.
Yeah.
Nick has basically handed us an entire archive. Because he isn't just showing us a cool piece of mountain history. He's using this immovable, perfect Sierra wall to ask a really profound question that has haunted Washington, D.C. for over 80 years.
Okay, let's unpack this, because that question is the core mission of our deep dive today.
Yeah.
We are unpacking an 80-year obsession in American politics. Why does the United States government keep trying and, repeatedly failing to rebuild the Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC?
Right.
If you look at historical polling, the bipartisan nostalgia, it was arguably the most universally popular thing Washington ever did. Yet they cannot seem to replicate it. So, we are going to trace this entire 80-year journey.
We really need to.
Yeah. We're going to start at that 1930s Sierra Wall to understand the benchmark. We'll walk through decades of federal attempts to bring it back. We will dissect the fatal vulnerabilities of modern presidents trying to build programs using executive action instead of doing the hard work of passing formal law.
Which is a huge theme in the sources.
Huge. And finally, we'll figure out why this core idea stubbornly refuses to die, somehow surviving and actually thriving today at the state level in places like California and Washington, even as the federal government collapses around it.
Yeah, the trajectory we are going to trace is just fascinating. It's a story of grand ambition, constantly colliding with modern political reality. And if you look at the visual backdrop we're working with here in the studio, we are shifting from that sprawling, rugged Sierra mountain range into this faded 1930s organizational blueprint.
Setting the stage.
Exactly. We need to establish the stakes of this conversation right from the jump. Because if you're listening to this, you might be wondering, well, why should I care about a 90-year-old jobs program or some bureaucratic funding fight in Washington?
Fair question.
But you should care, because this isn't just a story about government budgets. It is fundamentally about craftsmanship. It's about the value of physical labor. It's about your local state parks, your hiking trails, the flood defenses in your town, and ultimately how a nation chooses to build its legacy. And, whether we even know how to build things that last anymore.
Man, that's powerful. Let's start with that legacy because the sheer scale of the original CCC is almost impossible to comprehend today. It is this massive, overwhelming ghost that just haunts every single modern conservation effort.
It really does.
We hear politicians talk about creating a climate corps or a new CCC, but we have to understand the benchmark they're measuring themselves against. The original Civilian Conservation Corps operated from 1933 to 1942.
And the numbers from that 9-year window are staggering. I mean, the federal government employed roughly 3 million young men over that period.
3 million?
3 million. And they didn't just maintain existing infrastructure. They basically built the modern American outdoors. They developed around 800 state and national parks from scratch. They built over 100,000 miles of roads and trails. And the tree planting, they planted billions of trees. With a B.
Wait, billions?
Over 3 billion trees in less than a decade. It completely reshaped the physical landscape of the United States.
3 billion trees. I mean, you could not get the modern Congress to agree on the color of a tree today, let alone plant 3 billion of them.
No, absolutely not.
But I want to pull us back from that massive macro scale and look at the micro for a second. I want to return to Nick McKenzie standing at that dry stone wall in the Sierra High Country.
Yeah, let's go back there.
Because his firsthand testimony in the sources is so gripping. He explains the actual mechanics of the craftsmanship. Like, how does a wall with no mortar survive 90 years of mountain weather?
Well, it requires a level of engineering that is brilliant in its absolute simplicity. But it demands an excruciating amount of patience. Nick's field notes detail the architecture perfectly. To build a wall like this, you follow very strict, non-negotiable rules. First, you place the largest, heaviest stones at the bottom to anchor the entire structure's weight. Second, the joints must be crossed.
Meaning you can't have a vertical line running up the wall where 2 rocks meet, right? Like a zipper.
Precisely. No seam can run straight up the face.
Yeah.
The stones have to overlap, interlocking their weight, much like how a bricklayer staggers bricks, but, using irregular natural stone.
Right.
Because if a seam runs straight down, water finds it, freezes, expands, and basically splits the wall in half.
Ouch.
Yeah. And third, and this is a really fascinating detail from Nick's notes, they pack something called harding into the core of the wall.
Arthur.
Yeah, harding. It basically consists of smaller crushed stones packed tightly behind the main facing stones.
So instead of a solid block of concrete behind the wall, it's porous. Why wouldn't you want it to be solid?
Because of hydrostatic pressure. If you build a solid concrete wall on a mountain, water running down the slope gets trapped behind it. The water builds up immense pressure, and eventually it just blows the wall out.
Oh, wow.
Right. So by packing the core with crushed harding stone, water simply drains through the wall harmlessly. And the final, most crucial technique is that the entire face of the wall is battered back.
Battered, meaning it leans.
Yeah, it leans slightly backward into the slope of the mountain. Think of the physics at play here. When you batter a wall back into the slope, gravity is constantly pulling the rocks backward against the earth.
Okay, I'm tracking.
When frost heaves the ground during winter, the earth expands and pushes outward. But because the wall is leaning inward, the frost heave doesn't push it over. It actually compresses the rocks tighter together.
That is basically architectural judo. I mean, you are taking the very forces that want to destroy the wall gravity in winter weather, and you're using them to hold the wall together.
Exactly.
It's just ingenious. But, looking at this wall makes me think about how we build things today. Because we live in an era defined by planned obsolescence.
Oh, for sure.
We build $1,000 smartphones, fully expecting the battery to degrade and die in 2 years, forcing us to buy a new one. We buy major household appliances that magically experience catastrophic failure, like 3 days after the warranty expires.
It's maddening.
Everything is disposable. But these young guys, in 1933, they built a dirt trail in the middle of nowhere, expecting it to outlast their unborn grandchildren.
And that contrast between disposable modern consumerism and 1930s permanence is the exact tension the source material wrestles with.
Right.
And to understand how they achieved that permanence, we really have to deeply examine the very specific historical conditions of 1933.
Right.
Because it wasn't just that people back then magically cared more. They were operating in an environment that we simply do not have today. You had the Great Depression. The national unemployment rate was hovering around 25%.
Astronomical.
Yeah. And you had an absolute abundance of young, desperate labor willing to live in military-style work camps for $30 a month. most of which, by the way, they were required to send back home to keep their families from starving.
Right, the desperation was the fuel. But raw, desperate labor doesn't just naturally know how to build a battered, dry stone retaining wall. Someone had to know the physics.
Yes, and that is the second unique condition. The government hired local master masons, older men, many of whom were immigrants who had learned these old-world masonry techniques in Europe, and basically paid them to supervise and teach this young workforce.
Oh, wow.
So you paired raw, endless energy with master-level, old-world craftsmanship.
And they were doing this mostly by hand, right? The sources talk about pickaxes, rock bars, crosscut saws, and just bare hands. They weren't flying helicopters in to drop precast concrete blocks. They weren't driving massive excavators up the mountain.
Got it all. Which brings us to the most important ingredient of all, the one thing modern society completely lacks: time.
Time.
Yeah. When you are paying a young man $1 a day, and you have thousands of them, and you are entirely reliant on hand tools, you're not rushing to meet a mechanized corporate quarterly quota. You have the time to look at a raw boulder, study its grain, chisel it by hand, and set maybe 3 perfect stones in a single day.
Just 3 stones a day.
Yeah. The durability was a direct product of the time invested.
Okay, I have to challenge this premise, though. We are looking back at 1933 through these incredibly rose-colored glasses.
Fair point.
Is it just romantic nostalgia to think we can ever rebuild this today? I mean, can modern, fast-paced training methods, OSHA regulations, and 40-hour work weeks actually match the legendary durability of original CCC stonework? Or was that level of permanence strictly a one-time product of mass starvation and the Great Depression?
Well, that is the central debate in the policy circles Nick McKenzie documented. The harsh reality is that the exact labor conditions of 1933 are dead, and frankly, we should be thankful they're dead.
Yeah, nobody wants mass starvation.
Exactly. We don't have mass starvation driving a quarter of the population into the woods. The original CCCC didn't end because it failed. It ended because the nation went to war in 1942, and all that manpower was immediately diverted to the military.
Right, World War II.
But when the camps closed, they left behind this physical ghost. They left perfectly built timber lodges, stone bridges, and mountain trails. They proved what the American workforce was capable of. So while the Depression-era conditions vanished, the physical need for the work did not.
Forests still overgrow. Trails still erode.
Precisely. And that lingering need is what sparked this massive 80-year game of institutional whack-a-mole.
Institutional whack-a-mole is the perfect way to describe it, because the federal government stops doing the work in 1942, but the trees keep growing. The desire from young people to do the work is still there. So let's trace how this idea migrates after World War II, because every time Washington drops the ball, someone else scrambles to pick it up.
Yeah, the model absolutely refused to die. If we look at the immediate post-war period, the federal government is focused on the Cold War and, massive highway projects, not planting trees.
Right.
So in 1957, the private sector steps in. The Student Conservation Association, or the SCA, is created to place student volunteers in national parks to do the work the federal government was neglecting.
Okay.
And that model proved so popular that the federal government was eventually shamed into trying again. In the 1960s and 1970s, they created the Youth Conservation Corps, the YCC, and the Young Adult Conservation Corps.
So Washington is back in the game. They set up these federal programs. Young people are back in the woods. It feels like the CCC is having a renaissance. But then we hit the 1980s.
Oh, yes.
Specifically 1981. The Reagan administration comes in with a mandate to slash domestic spending, and massive budget cuts come down like a guillotine. The federal versions of the Corps are essentially gutted overnight. The federal government swings the axe and just walks away from the model again. What happens to all that momentum?
It retreats to safety. The federal landscape becomes hostile, so the Corps model migrates downward to the states.
Okay.
And the absolute flagship of this state-level rescue operation happens in California. In 1976, anticipating the unreliability of federal funding, Governor Jerry Brown founded the California Conservation Corps.
Using the CCC initials.
Yes. He deliberately used the CCC initials to echo Roosevelt's 1933 original. He wanted that brand association. And the state heavily invested in it. By 1983, California codified it, making it a permanent state agency.
Meaning it wasn't just a pilot program anymore. It was basically baked into the state budget.
Exactly. It became a fixture of California governance.
Yeah.
And today, it stands as the largest and longest-running conservation corps in the entire nation.
Wow.
And California was not alone. States and cities across the country saw the federal retreat and realized they had to build their own infrastructure. So by 1985, these scattered state and local Corps leaders got together and founded the Corps Network. The Corps Net. Yeah, this was a national umbrella organization designed to stitch all these localized, isolated efforts into a cohesive, shared movement. They shared training protocols, safety standards, and, crucially, lobbying power.
It is wild to think about the resilience of this idea. I mean, the federal government actively dismantles it, so the states just pick up the discarded blueprints, pool their resources, and keep building on their own. And our sources have this incredible detail that brings this whole state-level survival story full circle.
Oh, the Yosemite detail, yeah.
Yes. Right now, today, in 2026, modern crews from the California Conservation Corps and a group called the Yosemite Conservancy are up in the high Sierra Mountains. And do you know what they are doing? They are physically resetting the exact same stones on the Yosemite trails that the original 1933 CCC boys first cut.
It is a stunning visual of historical continuity. I mean, the 1930s workers laid the foundation, and their modern-day namesakes are maintaining it. But, this highlights a vital contrast between how states operate versus the federal government.
Oh, so
The state-level programs persist because they are incredibly nimble. They adapt directly to hyperlocal needs. In California, that might mean trail maintenance or wildfire brush clearing. In another state, it might be flood management.
right.
They are completely decoupled from the massive, slow-moving, intensely partisan apparatus of the federal government, which historically builds these giant programs up only to tear them down the second the political winds shift in Washington.
But this evolution raises a big question about the soul of the program for the listener. Because if we are talking about transforming the CCC from this massive, desperate grassroots movement in the 1930s where kids are sending pennies home to save their families into a highly structured, professionalized state agency today, what does that mean for the participants?
That's a great question.
Does shifting it to a state bureaucracy change the original community impact? Does it feel less like a grand, romantic national mission and more like just, I don't know, another standard job training program?
Well, it fundamentally changes the flavor of the experience, yes.
Yeah.
You lose some of the romanticized nationalistic fervor of the 1930s. It becomes less about, saving the nation and more about starting a career. But what's fascinating here is the states prove something vital.
What's that?
The core mechanics of the model still worked, even without the desperation of the Depression. Young people still actively wanted to serve outdoors, and the environmental work still desperately needed doing. And because the states kept the heartbeat alive so successfully throughout the 1980s, the federal government eventually couldn't resist looking at that success.
They wanted back in.
Exactly. Washington looked at California and the Corps Network and realized they wanted back in on the action.
Washington has severe FOMO. They realize the states are getting all the credit for this wildly popular idea, so they want to throw federal weight back behind it. Which leads us into the 1990s and the creation of what our sources refer to as the federal scaffold.
That is the perfect term for it. In 1993, under President Bill Clinton, Congress passed the National and Community Service Trust Act. This piece of legislation established AmeriCorps.
Okay.
Now, it is absolutely critical for us to understand how AmeriCorps was structured because it is entirely different from the 1933 CCC model. AmeriCorps was not designed as a top-down federal army of pickaxe swingers managed directly out of an office building in Washington, D.C.
Right, because if you join AmeriCorps, the President of the United States isn't telling you which specific pine tree to plant in an Iowa state park. So how does the scaffold actually function mechanically?
AmeriCorps functions primarily as a funding and credentialing backbone. Washington secures the massive pool of federal money. Then, instead of managing the projects themselves, they distribute that money outward in the form of grants to the state operations and local nonprofits, like the ones organized under the Corps Network, who already know how to run the crews.
So it is decentralized execution with centralized funding. Washington writes the check, but New York or Minnesota actually runs the crew.
Precisely. And our sources highlight several specific examples of how this looks on the ground. You have New York's Excelsior Conservation Corps, which launched much later in 2015, heavily supported by AmeriCorps funding and the Student Conservation Association.
Oh, the SCA is still involved.
Oh, yeah, very much so. You have Conservation Corps in Minnesota and Iowa. There is also a specific federal branch called AmeriCorps NCCC, the National Civilian Community Corps. This is a vital term to define for our listeners.
Go ahead.
NCCC is a full-time, team-based residential program for young adults aged 18 to 26. They travel the country completing different service projects, often deploying to disaster zones like hurricanes or floods. They're doing real heavy-duty critical infrastructure work.
So returning to my previous question about the soul of the program and professionalization versus the 1933 model, what are these 18 to 26-year-olds actually doing today? Because the sources are very clear. They are not just swinging pickaxes. This isn't raw, unskilled manual labor.
Not at all. Today's Corps members are gaining highly technical, modern career skills. We're talking about advanced trail construction using modern engineering standards, technical invasive species removal, which requires ecological knowledge, timber stand improvement, and, complex certified chainsaw operations for wildfire mitigation.
Wow, certified chainsaw operations. That's serious.
It is. These are specialized skills that translate directly into high-paying careers in forestry, environmental science, and emergency management. And furthermore, when they complete their service, they earn a Segal Education Award, which is a federal grant they can use to pay for college tuition or accredited trade schools.
So it's a massive stepping stone. It's meaningful professional development, creating a pipeline into the modern middle class rather than just a temporary way to keep from starving like it was in the Depression.
Exactly.
And there is a deeply structural reason why AmeriCorps has managed to survive for over 30 years, while other federal programs just vanished. It comes down to the mechanics of how it was created in 1993.
It comes down to one phrase: statutory law.
Statutory law.
The 1993 Trust Act was a piece of formal legislation. It was debated in the House, passed the Senate, and signed into law by the President. It is codified. When a program is protected by a statute, it establishes a legal baseline that makes the program incredibly difficult to simply erase.
Right, because it's officially on the books.
Exactly. It possesses a formal charter. It has a dedicated congressional appropriation line item. Dismantling AmeriCorps completely requires an entirely new act of Congress to repeal the 1993 law, which requires a majority vote in both chambers and the president's signature. That required the level of long-term armor that other administrative methods simply cannot match.
Here's where it gets really interesting. When you look at AmeriCorps acting as this funding scaffold and you look at this massive network of state programs doing the physical work, you realize something profound. The debate in Washington today isn't actually about whether the Corps model works. The heirs to the CCC already exist. They're quietly working in state parks, wearing hard hats and running chainsaws all across the country right now. The states prove the model works. The debate in Washington is whether we can afford to supersize it. Do we take this highly functional, decentralized state-level network, pump tens of billions of federal dollars into it, and attempt to recreate the massive, awe-inspiring scale of 1933?
And that specific ambition, the desire to supersize a working model into a national behemoth, sets the stage perfectly for the political explosions of the 2020s. If the state AmeriCorps hybrid is so successful, why not go all in? This ambition leads directly into a dramatic legislative brick wall.
Let's hit that wall.
Well, if you notice, the visual backdrop behind me is subtly shifting now. We are leaving the green, quiet mountain trails behind, and the imposing marble architecture of Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. is coming into sharp focus.
Capitol Hill.
The place where grand romantic dreams go to get debated into oblivion over budget scoring. Let's talk about the fall of 2021. The Biden administration and the Democratic majority in Congress are pushing a massive piece of legislation called the Build Back Better bill.
Right.
It passes the House of Representatives in November. And tucked inside this sprawling trillion-dollar package is a provision for something called the Civilian Climate Corps.
The Civilian Climate Corps, or the CCC, intentionally stealing the acronym again.
Naturally.
This was the most ambitious, most Roosevelt-like proposal in 80 years. The scale they were proposing was staggering. It called for up to $30 billion in dedicated funding.
$30 billion.
The goal was to employ roughly 300,000 members. It was explicitly modeled on the 1933 vision, but fully updated for modern climate realities, focusing on solar installation, coastal resilience, and urban heat islands alongside traditional forestry. 300,000 members and $30 billion. That is a massive leap from the quiet, steady, state-level programs. It is breathtaking ambition. But then, just a month later, in December 2021, the entire thing falls apart. The dream evaporates. And to understand why, we have to talk about the brutal realities of the legislative bottleneck.
The bottleneck here took the form of a single decisive vote in the United States Senate. The Senate was split 50-50. To pass Build Back Better through a process called reconciliation, Democrats needed every single member of their caucus to vote yes.
Every single one.
Right. In December, Senator Joe Manchin, Democrat from West Virginia, publicly announced he would not support the bill. Without his singular vote, the legislation collapsed. When the remnants of that bill were later salvaged and repackaged into the 2022 Inflation Reduction Act, the massive civilian climate core provision had been completely stripped out. It was gone.
Now, we need to pause here and be very clear. We are basing our deep dive entirely on the provided source material, and we are presenting this with complete impartiality. We are not taking sides on Senator Manchin's decision.
No, absolutely not.
Senator Manchin stated clearly on the public record that his reasons for opposing the bill were grounded in deep concerns over the massive overall cost, the impact on national inflation, and his reservations about forcing too rapid a pace for the national energy transition, which he felt could destabilize the grid.
That is correct. And on the flip side, we must note that severe critics of his decision argued publicly that his opposition was fundamentally tied to his representation of a coal-heavy state and the financial interests of his political donors in the fossil fuel industry.
Right. It is essential that we impartially report both of those viewpoints exactly as they are preserved in the historical record, without validating or endorsing either one. But moving past the political motivations, the structural outcome is what matters for our exploration today.
The legislative threshold.
Yes. Passing formal statutory law requires navigating these incredibly intense political bottlenecks. Because it failed to clear the Senate, this massive new core lost its chance at statutory permanence. It failed to get written into the law books. And, the danger of trying to bypass that difficult process makes me think of building a house.
How so?
Imagine you're out in the elements and you desperately need shelter. The legislative process is like digging a trench, laying rebar, pouring a massive concrete foundation, and framing out a house. It takes forever. It is incredibly frustrating. Everyone argues over the blueprints, and half the time the crew walks off the job.
Sounds about right for Congress.
Exactly. But when a massive storm finally comes, that house stands firm. Bypassing the legislative process because it is too hard is like deciding to just pitch a nylon tent instead. Sure, it's way faster. You are out of the rain by dinner time, and you get to take a picture of your nice new tent. But the very first major storm that rolls over that mountain is going to rip the stakes out of the ground and blow that tent into the next county.
The tent versus the foundation is a highly accurate way to frame what happens next. Because with the legislative route completely blocked by the Senate, the executive branch looked at the situation and decided they simply couldn't wait years to pour a foundation.
The political pace was demanding action.
Exactly. So they chose to pitch the tent. And that specific choice set the stage for a spectacular, completely predictable unraveling just a few years later.
Let's look at exactly how they pitched this tent. Fast forward to September 20th, 2023. President Biden uses his executive authority to bypass Congress and launch the American Climate Corps, the ACC.
The mechanics of how the ACC was constructed are critical to understand because it explains its ultimate doom. Because it was created by executive action rather than a congressional vote, there was no new appropriation of money.
No $30 billion check.
Exactly. Congress did not write a $30 billion check. And there was no new foundational statute. It was entirely built on what policy experts call borrowed authority.
Borrowed authority.
Yes. The administration stitched the ACC together using existing resources, existing legal authorities, and existing personnel from AmeriCorps and 6 other separate federal departments, including the Departments of Labor, Interior, and Energy.
So it's an interagency patchwork. They're just passing memos around Washington, pooling loose change from different couches to fund a unified brand.
Pretty much.
Despite that fragile structure, what were the numbers looking like? Was there actual public demand for this?
Oh, the public appetite was undeniable. The administration's initial target was to deploy roughly 20,000 members in its first year. Within 3 weeks of the official announcement, approximately 40,000 people had expressed formal interest online.
40,000 in 3 weeks.
Young people desperately wanted these jobs. By late 2024, our sources indicate roughly 15,000 members had officially joined and were actively working on projects.
15,000 people out in the field. But then the storm hits. January 20, 2025, Inauguration Day. President Trump takes office, and one of his early actions is signing an executive order titled Unleashing American Energy. Tucked inside that order is a directive that immediately terminates all activities, all funding, and all operations of the American Climate Corps. Just like that, the tent is blown away.
We should note that the outgoing Biden administration, kind of reading the political tea leaves, had already begun quietly winding down ACC operations in anticipation of the transition to minimize the shock to participants.
Yeah.
But the abrupt termination perfectly illustrates the inherent fatal vulnerability of relying on executive orders to create massive public programs.
Yeah.
It's a fundamental rule of Washington governance. What a pen creates, a pen can erase.
This goes right back to the point you made earlier about AmeriCorps surviving since 1993 because of statutory law. The American Climate Corps had no formal congressional charter to repeal. It had no specific legislative appropriation for its defenders to rally around. It died simply because a new president walked into the Oval Office and canceled a memorandum written by the previous guy.
If we compare the two models side by side, the executive-led ACC versus the formally legislated AmeriCorps, the difference in durability is staggering. An executive order is, by its very definition, a directive from the sitting president to the agencies they control. When a new president with entirely different political priorities takes over, they have the absolute authority to reverse those directives on day one.
But a statute is different.
A statutory law requires a majority of both chambers of Congress and a presidential signature to repeal, which is an infinitely higher hurdle to clear.
It's honestly a tragedy of borrowed authority. I mean, you look at the raw enthusiasm, 40,000 young people raising their hands in a matter of weeks saying, put me to work, I want to build something. The desire to serve this country is clearly still there, burning as bright as it did in 1933. But structurally, because the leaders bypassed Congress, they built a core with a timer attached to it. The countdown clock to its destruction started the exact moment the executive order was signed.
And if the story ended right there, with just the cancellation of the American Climate Corps, it would honestly be viewed by historians as politics as usual. You know, a new administration reversing the legacy executive actions of the previous one. It happens every transition.
Sure.
But in the spring of 2025, the dismantling went much deeper. The new administration didn't just take down the flimsy executive tent, they aimed their sights at the statutory bedrock of AmeriCorps itself.
Right. And here is where things get incredibly intense, and we start seeing the real-world consequences of Washington bureaucracy on local communities. We are moving into April 2025. A newly empowered entity called the Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE, steps into the picture, and they initiate what the source material refers to as the Friday night gutting.
The administrative actions taken in April 2025 were sweeping and deeply disruptive. DOGE pulled AmeriCorps NCC members, those residential teams we defined earlier who traveled to disaster zones and build infrastructure, directly off their active ongoing projects mid-deployment.
Wow, just pulled them out.
Yeah. Furthermore, they placed roughly 85% of the agency's federal staff on administrative leave. AmeriCorps was a relatively small federal agency of about 500 to 650 workers. Suddenly, over 400 of them are locked out of their emails and sent home.
I want the listener to understand how paralyzing that is. Imagine you're running a state park in Ohio. You rely on an AmeriCorps grant to pay the 10 kids clearing your trails. Suddenly, the federal officer in Washington who signs your compliance paperwork, approves your time cards, and authorizes your funding draws is just gone.
Completely unresponsive.
No out-of-office reply, just silence. The entire administrative pipeline freezes overnight. But then comes the biggest blow, April 25, 2025, after business hours on a Friday.
Yes. In a massive administrative move, DOGE officially terminated approximately $396.5 million in AmeriCorps grants. To put that abstract number into harsh perspective, that represented roughly 41% of the agency's total grant funding for the year.
Over 40% of the budget wiped out while everyone is at home eating dinner on a Friday. What does a cut of that magnitude actually look like on the ground for the people doing the work?
On the ground, the chaos was immediate. The termination affected an estimated 1,031 grantees. Those grantees are the local state parks, the city nonprofits, and the state-level conservation corps that rely on that federal funding scaffold we discussed. Consequently, the cuts instantly impacted roughly 32,465 Corps members across the country.
Imagine being one of those 32,000 young people. You're 20 years old, you're out in the woods of Montana clearing dry brush to prevent a wildfire from burning down a local town. Or you're in Louisiana mucking out flooded homes, and suddenly your Cree leader walks up on a Saturday morning and says, "Pack up the tools. The funding vanished last night. Go home."
It's devastating.
But the states, having survived the 1980s cuts, did not just take this lying down. 24 states banded together and aggressively sued the federal government over these sudden terminations.
And this legal fight back yields a fascinating, highly technical result that highlights the limits of executive power. On June 5, 2025, U.S. District Judge Deborah Boardman issues a pivotal ruling. She determines that the abrupt grant terminations likely violated the Administrative Procedure Act, commonly known as the APA.
Okay, we need to unpack the APA for the listener because that sounds like deep, impenetrable Washington legal jargon. What is the Administrative Procedure Act, and what does violating it actually mean in practice?
The Administrative Procedure Act is essentially the fundamental rule book for how the federal government is allowed to operate. It governs how federal agencies develop, issue, and repeal regulations and grants.
Yeah.
The core philosophy of the APA is that a government agency cannot simply make massive, sweeping, arbitrary changes overnight just because they feel like it. They're required to follow a strict process.
A process like what?
If they want to cut a program or change a rule, they must provide public notice, allow for a public comment period, and legally justify their reasoning with evidence. In her ruling, Judge Boardman cited the DOGE actions as categorical and vague, noting they completely lacked this required methodical process.
Right.
Because the federal government skipped the rule book, she ordered the grants and the Corps members restored in the specific states that had brought the lawsuit.
So it was a massive legal win for the states, but in reality, it was an incredibly messy one. It proves that even with the ironclad statutory protection of the 1993 Trust Act, a federal agency can still be severely paralyzed by aggressive executive maneuvers. The legal win in court was real, but the operational damage on the ground was already done.
Oh, absolutely.
Projects were abandoned halfway through, trust was broken, young people had already gone home to find other jobs, and the federal system was left totally fractured. It makes you step back and wonder, is this just how popular institutions die in the modern era? Not by an honest, open floor vote in Congress, where representatives have to bravely put their names on a voting tally to end a widely popular program, but by quietly cutting the grants after business hours on a Friday so no one notices until Monday morning.
It is a profoundly sobering question about the obscure mechanics of modern governance and how power is actually wielded. But, if we connect this to the bigger picture and pivot to the final chapter of our deep dive, the aftermath of this 2025 crisis reveals something incredibly inspiring about the resilience of the original model.
I could use some inspiring news.
Well, by January 2026, the federal landscape is a smoking crater of litigation, frozen funds, and diminished capacity. But what does the core idea do? It does exactly what it did back in 1981. It retreats to safety.
To the states.
Exactly. If you look at the visual backdrop now, we are moving entirely away from the chaotic marble imagery of Washington, D.C., and returning to the thriving, green, state-level forests.
The states stepped up again because they know the physical reality of the world hasn't changed. The overgrown trees don't care about the Administrative Procedure Act. The looming wildfires don't check the Federal Register to see if a grant was canceled on a Friday before they ignite. The work has to get done regardless of Washington's dysfunction.
So what does the landscape actually look like in January 2026?
The Federal Climate Corps vision is effectively dead as a unified national entity. But the state programs are successfully managing to sustain their funding and keep their crews in the field, despite the massive budgetary uncertainty at the federal level.
And how exactly are they pulling that off when the federal scaffold is crumbling? Where is the money coming from? They are surviving by relying entirely on internal state-generated mechanisms. Look at the California Climate Action Corps. They are funded directly by the state's own budget. Because of that insulation, they are keeping roughly 400 members actively working on critical local projects, like home fire hardening, which means creating defensible space around vulnerable homes, and massive food waste diversion programs to reduce methane emissions from landfills.
That's California. What about other states?
Then look at Washington State. Rather than waiting for D.C., they stood up a completely new, independent Washington Climate Corps network, and they are funding it brilliantly, using revenues generated from their own state Cap and Invest program.
Let's define Cap and Invest quickly for the listener so they understand the genius of that funding stream.
Certainly. In a Cap and Invest system, the state sets a hard limit, or cap, on the total amount of greenhouse gases that major polluting industries are allowed to emit. If a company wants to emit pollution, they have to purchase allowances at a state auction.
Okay, so they have to pay for the right to pollute.
Exactly. The money generated from selling those pollution allowances is the invest part. Washington State takes that option revenue and funnels it directly into environmental programs.
Oh, that's smart.
So, using that independent money, Washington announced nearly $1.5 million in 2025 grants for their Corps members to do vital work like estuary restoration and building local community resilience against extreme heat and wildfire smoke.
It's brilliant policy design. They are completely insulating themselves from the political drama in D.C. by paying for the environmental cleanup using revenue generated directly from the polluters in their own state. It's a closed loop. But, as we look back at this entire 80-year saga, from the Sierra Wall to the Friday Night, gutting our sources ask us to present the honest, overarching case for and against a modern National Service Corps.
We really have to.
Because despite the nostalgia, there are very real, very valid arguments on both sides of this debate. And to fulfill our mission of total impartiality, we want to lay both out fairly.
Let's start by presenting the strongest case for a massive modern National Service Corps. First, the physical need for public works is permanent and growing. We have rapidly aging infrastructure, decades of deferred maintenance on national trails and forests, and critical flood defenses that the private, profit-driven market simply is not incentivized to fix.
Right.
Second, the original CCC proved unequivocally that the model works, and it remains one of the most popular federal initiatives in American history, crossing partisan lines in a way almost nothing else does. Third, a National Corps offers young people a structured, non-military path into adulthood, providing them with technical skills, discipline, and education benefits while building public goods that benefit society for generations.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
And as our guide Nick McKenzie points out, the stonework itself is the ultimate argument. 90 years later, the wall still carries the trail. The proof of value is literally carved in stone.
That is an incredibly powerful case for doing this on a national scale. But the case against a massive federal corps is also grounded in very real pragmatic concerns. First and foremost is the astronomical cost. $30 billion is a massive commitment of taxpayer money, especially during periods of high national inflation and soaring federal debt.
A huge concern for many lawmakers.
Second, there are legitimate federalism objections. The core argument here is that states already do this better anyway, as we literally just saw with the success of California and Washington. So why create a giant, redundant, sluggish national bureaucracy to micromanage them?
Right.
Third, critics argue that a massive federal jobs program paying high wages could actively compete with private sector hiring, hurting small businesses. They worry it could easily devolve into taxpayer-funded make work if the projects aren't managed with strict oversight.
And there is a fourth, deeply structural argument against trying to recreate the CCC, the complete mismatch of labor and societal conditions. The 1933 CCC succeeded in building 90-year walls, partly because of mass unemployment, a desperate abundance of cheap labor willing to suffer extreme hardship, and a reliance on skilled local masons who had the immense luxury of time to teach methodical handcraft. None of those extreme conditions exist in the modern economy of 2025.
Right. You can't just throw 300,000 modern teenagers who grew up with smartphones into the woods with pickaxes, pay them $1 a day, and expect them to happily build a mortarless stone wall that lasts a century. Society has changed. Expectations of labor have changed.
Totally.
So synthesize this entire 80-year journey for us. We started at the pristine Sierra Wall in 1933. We waded through the 2025 federal failure and the court battles, and now we are back looking at the resilient state programs. What is the ultimate takeaway the listener should walk away with?
The synthesis of this entire deep dive is that a country keeps desperately reaching for this overwhelmingly popular idea. We saw the attempts with the YCC in the 70s, the State Corps in the 80s, AmeriCorps in the 90s, the Civilian Climate Corps in 2021, and the American Climate Corps in 2023. Because the needed answers is foundational to the American landscape.
Yeah.
Yet the federal government repeatedly refuses to build the program to last. Modern presidents opt for the quick, vulnerable flash of executive actions rather than doing the grueling, unglamorous political work of securing statutory permanence through Congress. When those fragile executive-led federal attempts inevitably collapse, as we saw with breathtaking speed in 2025, the mission only survives because nimble, independent states like California and Washington are standing by with their own nets to catch it.
It brings me right back to the question of craftsmanship that we started this whole journey with. That 1930s original dry stone wall worked and survived because of a unique, unrepeatable convergence of economic desperation and old-world mastery. Perhaps the profound reason the Conservation Corps model survives best at the state level today isn't just about escaping toxic DC politics.
What do you think it is then?
Maybe it's because states are the only entities capable of tailoring the actual work to highly specific, modern professional needs like estuary restoration in Washington or fire hardening homes in a specific California county, rather than the federal government trying to force a one-size-fits-all national army of pickaxes onto a modern landscape. The nature of the environmental work evolved drastically, so the administrative structure had to evolve from a national monolith into a network of local specialists.
That is a very astute observation. The successful states are surviving because they are practicing a highly evolved, modern form of craftsmanship. They are applying specific, modern tools like cap and invest funding and specialized chainsaw training to specific local problems, rather than seeking a blanket, mandated federal solution that doesn't fit their unique geography.
So, to recap the core lesson of today's deep dive, America keeps falling in love with this idea. We deeply, intrinsically want young people out in nature, learning hard skills, breaking a sweat, and physically building our country.
Yes, we do.
But Washington, D.C. repeatedly refuses to build the program itself out of stone. They keep pitching flimsy nylon tents for the press conference. And when the political winds change and the tents inevitably blow away, the states are the ones left standing in the rain, holding the blueprints, doing the actual work.
It is a relentless cycle of grand ambition followed by hasty retreat, and it has defined environmental labor in this country for 80 years.
Which brings us back, finally, to the man who started us on this journey, Nick McKenzie. I want you to picture him again, standing at that 90-year-old CCC dry stone wall in the High Sierra. The air up there is still cold. The dirt trail is still holding firm against gravity, against frost heave, and against the spring snowmelt.
Still there.
That wall does not argue politics. It doesn't care about the Administrative Procedure Act or the limitations of executive orders or Friday night budget cuts in Washington. It just does exactly what it was built to do day after day because the people who built it took the time, the care, and the effort to build it right from the very beginning.
It stands as a silent, enduring witness on the mountain. It's physical proof of what actually happens when a nation decides to invest in true permanence.
And that leaves me with a final thought for you, the listener, to mull over as you go about your week. Something that builds on everything we've unpacked today. We keep asking why the modern government can't recreate the massive success of the CCC. But if the stonework of the 1930s has survived 90 years of brutal mountain weather, while our modern federal initiatives can't even survive a single change in presidential administration, what does that actually say about us? What if our modern inability to recreate the CCC isn't a failure of government design or budgets at all? What if it's a reflection that our modern society, at its very core, simply no longer truly values permanence in anything we build?
That is a profoundly challenging question to walk away with.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the source material. We will see you next time.